Short stick exercise introduction. We're going to be using short sticks, which you could call Arnis sticks, for exercise flow workout purposes. We want to emphasize the idea that we're using them for exercise and flow workout purposes for multiple different reasons. One being that whenever we talk about short sticks or similar types of items, the platforms we use for distribution of the information might associate them with martial arts, which might not be bad in and of itself, except that they then could associate the martial arts to fighting to violence, which leads to the limitation of the distribution of the information, which we can also see if you try to search for short sticks in the form of Arnis sticks on certain websites and are located, like I am, in California. You might say, it looks like they're limiting the reach, even though it's just a stick, for crying out loud. It's not even a hardwood stick. It's like a reed that is not that heavy, and so on and so forth. So there's absolutely no reason you would think that there would be a limit to the distribution. So it's kind of strange. And I think those first two items lead to the main third item, which is part of the target demographic that I would like to try to reach. And that is that these many people, if they're interested in learning something like exercising with a short stick, might be dissuaded from doing so if they search for content and they notice that it's limited, or if they try to buy the short sticks and they're not available. Then they're going to say, these are associated with something bad. They're clearly restricted. Maybe I should just stay away from that entirely, which I think is very sad for multiple different reasons. One of those reasons being that it's a great exercise. Many of the martial arts are going to be great exercise just for exercise purposes, which I might get into in more detail here shortly. So this course reimagines the use of the Arnis sticks, which I'm just going to call the short sticks, as a tool for fitness, coordination, mindful movement, rather than combat. So we will be learning to basically handle the sticks, which you could use if you were going to have them in like a combat type of scenario, but we're going to be focusing more on just flowing with the sticks, going back to forth, force with them, flowing them over our wrist, rolling them over the wrist and back over the wrist, and even flipping them, similar to a juggling pin or possibly a baton, which are maneuvers that you wouldn't actually do in combat. You're not going to flip the stick around, although they are great tools to just get an idea of the feel for the stick. So instead of focusing on fighting applications, the training emphasizes fluid movement, dexterity, and fun, similar to how juggling pin or flow arts function. So if you look at certain types of martial arts, sometimes there's more focus on just the flow as a type of meditation. I think many martial arts have that component to it, even the ones that are focused in more on a combat type of scenario. And I think that is in part because if you're trying to work out the body and try to exercise the movements of the body, there's no better way to do that than to think that you're going to be in a competitive situation physically against another body that functions in a similar way. So even if you're not trying to hurt the other person, it's just play, those kind of thought processes are the ways that you can fully exercise the movements of your body. So I think there's a reason, even if you're not trying to be in a combat setting or looking for self-defense type courses and whatnot, that you would want to learn things that grew out of that tradition, because that would be the natural way that anything learns, right? Any animal learns, by basically play fighting at the least, right? So it's just a good exercise. So the movements are designed to be performed indoors, making it accessible for people who want to stay active while watching TV or listening to an audiobook or something like that. Now the short sticks, the Arnis sticks, are pretty small, and that means that you don't really need a lot of room. And this is another thing that I think might throw people off when they look up information. You're often going to find people that are really trying to emphasize their credentials, and I really admire that, and that's great. But you're often seeing someone in a big studio they're decked out in their martial arts gear and whatnot, which again, I think is a good way to show credentials and that you're qualified to teach people and whatnot. But I think a certain type of demographic might be kind of turned off from that as they're trying to learn it just for exercise purposes. And you don't need a big studio to learn how to rotate a stick it's not even a bow staff, so you don't even really need to be outside. The stick is fairly light, so if it flies out of your hand, it might not even break the TV if it hit the TV, right? It's pretty light. Now, if you get a heavier stick, it might, but you need a fairly limited room, and once you get good at it, it becomes routine, as does certain types of flow martial arts. And when it becomes routine, then you can do it while listening to an audiobook or doing other types of things. So, background of the Escriba sticks. I won't go into this basically in detail. I'm not an expert at the background of the Escriba sticks, but I just want to kind of touch in on it a little bit. So I'm going to call them the short sticks, Escriba stick. Escriba stick, commonly associated with Filipino martial arts like Eskrima, Arnis, and Kali, are traditionally used for self-defense, combat, coordination training. They are typically made of rattan. Now, you don't have to use rattan, but I think it's a great material. Again, if you're in California, it might actually be a little difficult to buy a rattan stick, which again is ridiculous because a rattan stick is a lot lighter, and wouldn't even qualify as wood, let alone basically a hardwood. It's more of a reed type of thing. It's similar to bamboo, and that it's not really a wood, it's more like a reed, but it's also different because it doesn't have a hollow center to it, but it has flexibility to it. And the reason that is really great is because you can get a fairly thin stick that has enough weight that it could rotate around, and you need enough weight for it to rotate around, but you can still have it pretty thin and not break when you hit things with it because it has give to it, because it's a reed and not a hardwood stick. Now, note that you could get a hardwood stick, possibly because you can't get rattan because they won't let you buy it where you're at, which would be funny, or possibly rattan at a screen. Because of that, it might be more expensive as well. And you might say, why am I paying all this money for a stick? So you could make a stick out of anything. But if you make it out of like a hardwood, like a redwood or something like that, it's going to be a lot heavier, which could be good because that'll make the rotation go around. However, if you hit yourself with it, it'll hurt a lot more than rattan. And you do hit yourself with the stick from time to time when you're kind of flipping it around. So be careful with that. If it flies out of your hand, a hardwood stick is much more likely to break the TV if it flies out of your hand than a rattan type of stick. And it's not as flexible. So if you want to get a thinner stick, then it's more likely to break over time if you hit something with it. Whereas you can actually hit things hard with a rattan stick that's quite thin, and it shouldn't break because it's going to have some give to it. If you use something that's too light, like a PVC pipe or something like that, it's not going to work well for you because it's going to be too light and you won't feel the weight of it, especially when you try to flip it and rotate it like a baton or something. You could fill the PVC pipe with something to give it a little bit more weight, or put tape on it to give it a little bit more weight. If you do fill it with something or put tape on it, make sure you do it evenly over the entire stick, because you want the center of gravity of the stick to be about the middle of it. So if you put something in the middle of the stick to weight it down a little bit and only on one side, or worse, it goes up and down the stick as you flip it, that'll be really bad because it's the weight, the weight will shift as you flip the stick. Okay, so then in traditional systems, training involves strike patterns, blocking, disarming, and pattern drills. So you can imagine, a drills and more of a combat type of scenario if you're trying to train multiple people with the sticks. Many people imagine the sticks with the two rattan sticks, which has interesting drills to it. It's a lot more difficult to just do the two sticks because you'll almost have like two almost short sword length sticks. But there's a traditional patterns that you can use, which you're actually facing more head on to someone rather than facing at the side. And if you use those patterns, it actually acts as a blocking pattern, which works quite well. We're going to be working more with one stick. A lot of times in traditional training, they will practice strikes with one stick that you can then combine together with two sticks. Or sometimes you might think of the one stick as similar to like a short sword, because it's kind of like the length of a short sword, which I think they use in traditional fighting scenarios in the Philippines, a type of short sword with a sword maybe around the size of like a old Roman short sword. So you can kind of imagine the stick as a short sword, where you would be imagining the one side of the stick being the sharp part of the stick. But again, you don't really need to do that. You can think of it as just a stick in and of itself, even if you want to think of striking with a stick, because a rattan stick, although it's a reed, can have effective striking power if you follow through with the striking power, but it has more of a whipping motion than, of course, a cutting motion or a hardwood motion, which is a more thud kind of, rather than a whip kind of thing. But again, our focus, while we might do some striking, is not going to be mainly focused on striking, but rather we're going to be focusing on the flow type of things, which you might do with a stick to get a better feel for them, but you clearly wouldn't be flipping a stick around in the middle of a combat situation. So why train with a single stick? So it improves hand-eye coordination. The movements enhance precision, reaction time, and control. So one stick actually works quite well to kind of go back and forth from one hand to the other. Practice like rotating it over the back of your hand. You can kind of flip it on one hand, rotating it around your thumb. It's great for hand-eye coordination. I got into some of these type of activities like a juggling pin, a stick, a bow staff, because I had a lazy eye situation. I had to have a patch on my eye for like when I was a kid and stuff because it got so bad, and you lose depth perception. So I felt like something that I practice juggling, where I have to use two eyes to be able to catch things, would be a good practice for my bad eye vision. But just dexterity, of course, would be great for that too. If you the movements of it are great for just that kind of thing. Enhances mobility and flexibility. The exercise engages wrists, arms, shoulders, promoting flexibility and reducing stiffness. So once we learn certain patterns, the patterns are going to be more full body patterns. So it's not like you're doing as intense a workout as like running to get cardio. If you want cardio, running is great or something like that. But running is very structured. So you're really trying to specialize in a very routine movement that's always the same, which is great. But if you learn something like these kind of things, what you're doing is not as intense in terms of cardio, getting the heart up as high, although you can get quite intense if you're doing strikes and stuff. But it's actually movement of more of the body. So now you're gonna be practicing different movements of the body. So if you're working out on different things, it kind of depends on what your objective is. Are you trying to bulk up? Are you trying to get more endurance? Or are you trying to actually do more functional things so you can improve mobility type of thing? This thing is more towards mobility, hitting more muscle groups and so on, and so builds grip, strength, endurance, holding and maneuvering the sticks repeatedly, strengthens the hands and forearms. Now, note that it does give you a workout on your forearms, even though it's a light stick. So a lot of people, especially a lot of guys, bigger guys oftentimes are going to say, well, that's too light. That's going to do nothing for working out, because a lot of people, especially these days, it seems like getting bigger, like muscle for muscles, just getting big, right, is like a goal in and of itself, which is cool. And that's not clearly that you're not going to get big by rotating the stick, but it will work out your forearm. It's not going to give you like Popeye forearms or anything like that. It's going to give you more of that lean kind of muscle that might be more longer endurance rather than the short burst muscles that you might get from working out. Me personally, like when I was growing up, I was into like basketball was my favorite sport for a while, and it was kind of interesting to watch because a lot of times they would think that the basketball players shouldn't get too big because they would think that they're going to lose flexibility. They won't be able to jump as high or swing the ball around as fast or whatever. And then later on, obviously a lot of the basketball players get pretty bulked up. Like Kobe Bryant got pretty big and so on, and he still was quite maneuverable. So I don't really know exactly where the point is where bulking up becomes detrimental to mobility. But I certainly think that if your goal is bulking up, that you should also put in something that practices mobility at the same time. So that you're practicing movement. Obviously, like a Kobe Bryant is practicing movement all the time. So I think bulking up at the same time would work well. But if he bulked up and didn't practice basketball, I'm not sure what the movement. Anyway, encourages flow and focus like Tai Chi or juggling, practicing stick flow, and can be meditative, help with relaxing and concentration. So, Tai Chi type of exercise, when you look at it, if you look at the movements, they can look quite complex, and a lot of them are. I'm not like an expert at Tai Chi or anything, but if you break down the movements to the simple components, I think you'll find that the movements are fairly easy, small movements that we can then put together. And that's what I'm going to try to do here. This is what I do in a lot of my courses where I teach like accounting and other kind of things, where you take things that they're not exactly complex, because like we're not talking about like really complex equation or something. We're talking about little steps that when you put them together, they create something, possibly more complex than the parts, right? Similarly here, if you take Tai Chi, small movements, but then you learn a lot of them, and then you link them together, and then you practice the ability to flow from movement to movement, giving you an ability to link them together in different ways, which means that over time, even with a small number of movements, the fact that you can switch them or change them slightly and link them together in a very large, different and numerous combination of ways means you have like an infinite different movements, even though you're doing the same forms, right? So it's kind of similarly here. We'll learn different small pieces that you can kind of put together, and you can link together in any way you want. Then you can, once you get good at that, you could think of it as a meditation. I like to sometimes put like just water sounds behind it, like a meditation. I kind of like a harp lately. I've never done that before, like harp sounds, but I've been listening. YouTube has harp stuff, which is cool. So I listen, and a steel drum. I never really listened to a steel drum much, but it's kind of interesting. Or if you get good at it, you can listen to an audio book or something like that. I find that I can actually listen to an audio book at 1.5 the speed to 2 times the speed. I think 1.5 is about it gets too fast other than that. And I can listen to it better when twirling a stick around than if I was actually to sit down and just try to concentrate on the audio book. And I think that the movement is actually good to learn to read, right? Which to me, again, I think is great, because now you have these audiobooks and you have YouTube and stuff, whereas before, clearly you can't do that if you're physically reading. So to me, these tools that we have these days are just amazing, that you can stand up and walk around, go for a hike, and listen to an audiobook at the same time. But anyway, accessible to convenient, requires minimal space, and can be done in a living room, making it ideal for at-home training. So again, I want to emphasize that when you look up these tools, you're most likely going to find people that are highly skilled, but again, they're really focusing their credentials, like obviously as a martial artist, which I think is good. You should learn from anybody that has the skill, learn from them. But I think some people find that to be possibly intimidating. So you might just realize that, of course, you're dealing with a stick that's pretty light. You don't need a lot of room. You don't need to be in a studio to flip a stick around. You could do it in your living room. You just move the couch out of the way, and then you can, that's all the room you need. You don't even need a high ceiling like you would with a bow staff or anything. So it's totally doable. Step-by-step learning. So step-by-step learning is like what I do. If you followed me on my accounting stuff or anything like that, I try to break things down into small steps. So that's what we'll do here. We'll learn a lot of small movements. Some of those small movements will be combined together towards like a bigger movement. So like flipping the stick, for example, we'll try to break that down into its components over maybe a couple presentations. But other movements, like I said, are kind of like the Tai Chi thing, where you can learn multiple movements that are all pretty simple if you look at them in isolation. And then once you're good at them, the practice is putting those things together. I think of this as similar to like a drummer. And when I think of a drummer, I'm thinking more of like a drummer, like I've watched these African drummers where there's a group of them and they're all drumming, and then they're doing the same thing, and then all of a sudden they change the beat a little bit. And the amazing thing with that is that they change the beat, but they all seem to change at the same time. It's like no one seems to be leading the change, which is kind of crazy because you got multiple people. But the thing here is we only have one person. We don't have multiple people that are changing the practice, although you could try that with multiple people. That'd be kind of interesting. But as you change, but you're still kind of changing the movements, right? So you're kind of changing, okay, I'm going from this movement and then I'm just going to change the rhythm, or I'm going to change, like, I'm going to turn a little bit, or I'm going to change the tempo of it, or I'm going to change the combination of this simple movement to this simple movement. And those little changes, of course, lead to an infinite amount of things that you can do. So if you just learn a few different simple things, you can piece them and put them together. So participants will gradually build skills from basic to complex motions. So again, some of the motions like flipping it, or we're going to actually get to catching it behind our back. That's somewhat of a complex motion, but a lot of the other motions are all pretty simple. It's not like a lot of motions, you're not getting more complex. You're just learning a different motion, which you can then put together with another motion, and it's linking them together that becomes somewhat complex or makes a more complex thing from a bunch of simpler things. So fundamental movements. So wrist rolls, circular motions to build fluidity. So we'll practice rotating the stick around the back of our hand. That's one fundamental movement that gets a little bit hard at first, but once you get it, it's pretty easy, and it can lead into a lot of other movements. We'll flip it around our thumb, which is a common kind of movement just to get a feel for the stick. We'll rotate it back and forth, and we'll put it under, and we'll practice like circular movements going from one hand to the other hand. So how we can flow back and forth from the left to the right fairly easily. Finger twirls and transferring, developing dexterity. So we're not going to really rotate it around our fingers like a pencil per se, but we'll rotate it over the back of our hand and do that and do some of those kind of movements. Flow patterns, linking different movements together for smooth execution. So we'll try to be able to go back and forth with the stick. We will practice strikes, and strikes are basically a figure eight type of flow when you're doing downward strikes, or figure eight when you're doing upward strikes. So we're not going to put our focus isn't on strikes per se, but strikes, of course, will fit into any kind of flow routine. It's a natural thing to do with the sticks, just a natural movement. Directional changes, switching grips, and altering movement direction seamlessly. So once we have the general forms down, then again you can adjust them. And one of the major things we can do is go back and forth. We flip the stick clockwise, and then we go counterclockwise. We go to the right hand, we go to the left hand, and then we can rotate around directionally ourselves too in a circle. Incorporating movements and rhythm, and encouraging natural movements of the arms and upper body to complement stick flow. Note that a lot of times we're like in our body here, we think that we know how to use them pretty well, but I think we'll find that if we start doing different things, we're not able to maneuver our body as well as we kind of think, right? And I think martial arts, once again, is one of the best things you can do to learn kind of movement. And it's not really about combat a lot of times. It's just about learning movement, like in a play type of way. I grew up in in Redondo Beach and like by Torrance, where they had the Gracie thing was happening there in the martial arts, and they're clearly oftentimes looking more towards like not really hurting people. Oftentimes a defense type of thing is, I think, an emphasis, but also it just seems like, again, you're kind of learning how the body moves by basically wrestling with other people. A lot of the other movements in martial arts, I think, are going to be in a similar nature when you want to basically learn, just movement of the body, focusing on how you would be in a competitive situation with a body that works similarly seems the way to do that. So practicing transactions between movements with rhythm, dance-like quality. So once you get the general moves down, we can think of the moves by counting through them, as we would do it to a beat, for example. And then, of course, we can change those beats as we do the rhythm, which you can think of as kind of like an internal drum beat or a dance move if you so choose, and so on. So progression to more dynamic movements, so learning to adopt movements while standing, sitting, or even walking around. So we're going to focus mainly on standing positions movements, but we are talking about a short stick. So you could basically sit on the couch and adopt some of the moves of a short stick to a couch procedure, especially like just like rotating it on your wrist to give you a little bit of a wrist workout, for example. Once you get good at these and you're starting to be able to lift your feet up and so on, then you should be able to take these same movements and walk around, at least pace back and forth around your space. And you don't need a lot of room to pace back and forth too. It's a fun thing to do. Exploring variations inspired by juggling, baton twirling, and freestyle flow arts. So then once we learn how to flip the thing, which is a little bit more of an advanced situation, then we can flip it, not so much like juggling, but I say juggling pin because that's the first thing that possibly comes to mind, often more like a baton. If you think about the person at the front of the marching band, the guy throws that thing up in the air. And the only reason for that is, as we'll talk about more, because the center of gravity of a stick is in the middle of the stick as opposed to in the handle. The complex or weird nature or shape of a juggling pin puts the center of gravity more towards the handle, and that's one of the things that makes it ideal to flip in front of you like that, which is actually kind of a weird thing to do. For most things don't flip that way, so most things flip easier, kind of like a baton flip. So we'll talk more about that too.